Question: what size overcurrent protection device would you use for the AC output of a 7 kilowatt inverter on a single family house? Would it be 25 amps, 30 amps, 40 amps, or 45 amps? Some of you might be able to take an educated guess on this one right off the bat because you know with the 120% rule, you've got a 200 amp service, 200 amp breaker, 200 times 1.2 is 240, subtract off 200, leaves you with a 40 amp breaker. And you know that you could put a 7.6 kilowatt inverter there, probably if you're doing solar sales, which is double of a 3.8 kilowatt inverter for somebody that has a 100 amp breaker, 100 amp bus bar. And so 7.6 isn't that much more than 7. And so you round up for the breaker size, and I'm going to just take a guess over here at 40 amps. If it said 35, I might have to think a little bit more, but that's not even an option. So I'm pretty sure the answer is going to be 40. One thing that I could have done too is figure out the ratio of 7 to 7.6 to kind of get me there, because it's a little bit smaller than 7.6, but we kind of get the point. And then also, single family house is keyword for 240 volts. So let's do some breaker math and break it down. What we can see here too is a circuit breaker, very common looking circuit breaker. It's a 30 amp breaker though. That might not be the right answer there. It is turned off. It's the plug-in type of a breaker. It says 10,000 amps there. That's the ampere interrupt rating. So that might not be enough for a supply side connection, probably not. That means that if it was greater than 10,000 amps coming at this thing, it might not be able to handle it. It might be bad for the breaker. We could see 120, 240 volts AC, copper and aluminum. That's Cu and Al. Those are the symbols for copper and aluminum. UL listed, common trip. That's another thing we could talk about here too, is when you lose one phase, you're going to lose both at once. And so it turns off both at once. You don't turn off line 1 and line 2 separately. That's a 2-pole breaker catching 2 different bus bars that are 240 volts apart from each other. So let's do the math. 7 kilowatts is what we have for the inverter. That is power. Kilowatts are power. We're assuming 240 volts is what we're connecting to. That's the 2 different bus bars that are fingering in and out between each other. And so we're going to convert to watts. Don't forget to do that, or your answer will be off by 3 orders of magnitude. That's 1,000, 3 decimal places. So 7,000 watts divided by 240 volts is 29.2 amps. The way that we remember this, volts times amps equals watts. Watts is by itself. Watts stays on top. Watts over volts equals amps. We've got 29.2 amps. So 7,000 watts divided by 240 volts is 29.2 amps. And now the next thing that we have to do is to multiply times 1.25. That's that 125% correction factor that we have to multiply our current by to get the overcurrent protection device size. And you know what? My first time around with this, I forgot to do that. And so when I was recording this video and when I was looking over this page and I said about the educated guess to 7.6, that's how I caught myself. So if you ever can make an educated guess, do it, because that's how you catch yourself. You should know where you're going. And don't feel bad when you make a mistake, because everybody makes a mistake. And I made a mistake and I finally caught myself. You know, when you're making hundreds of practice test questions, you're going to make a mistake. And also, I like to thank people that help me catch mistakes. They're even in books, things like that. I even have a page on my website for book corrections. Thanks to many of you that are helping me find these things. So anyway, don't forget that 125%. That's a 1.25. The reason we have that is we need to be able to handle currents for long periods of time, and breakers are usually thermally activated. That means when it gets too hot on something inside of the breaker, it trips. From too much current makes it hot. And on a hot day, you don't want to have false trips. You don't want to be running 40 amps on a 40 amp overcurrent protection device all day on a hot day, because everything might be going perfect and then it false trips. And so to prevent these false trips, we have this 125% correction factor here. And then we get 36.5, and we have to round up to a 40 amp overcurrent protection device because nobody makes a 36.5 amp overcurrent protection device. Maybe you should come up with it, but it's in the NEC. So here are the standard ampere, that's amp ratings, after Henry Ampere was the guy's name, came up with the current. Too bad he just wasn't named Mr. Current, and then it would have made things a lot easier. But I guess his nickname was Amp. Hey, Amp. So we can see we're kind of going up 5 amp increments up here until we get to 50. We're jumping at 10 amp increments up to 110, 25 amp increments up until we get to 250, and so on and so forth. See how it kind of goes up like this. Then if we're going to lower ratings, we can have 1, 3, 6, and 10 for our fuses, but we're not really dealing with that. That's just too little current for most of the things that we're dealing with in this industry. But if you ever wanted to look this up, you got 240.6. Sometimes though, let's say that a 25 amp breaker is rare and you can use a 30 amp breaker where it calls for a 25 amp breaker if, say, the inverter or piece of equipment was tested to be protected by a 30 amp breaker. That would be like the wires and stuff inside of the inverter could handle that. Plus, you have to double check when you're doing wire sizing calculations that a 30 amp breaker would protect your conductor. So in some cases, you would have to oversize your wire a little bit. And so there it is. There's that 2-pole 240 volt breaker. Another thing too is this could be used for 12208, just 2 out of 3 phases. So it's possible, it's been done, where you could use single phase inverters on a 3-phase service. It's not against the rules, although some people think it is. But we use single phase loads on 3-phase services. So why not a single phase source on a 3-phase service? In fact, in Germany, where my friend sells solar, residential services are 3-phase. And he's out there selling single phase inverters and 3-phase inverters. It's not going to throw everything off balance, just like a single phase load doesn't throw everything off balance. In fact, if you put all the sources where all the loads are, like if you had too many loads on one phase, you put the solar on that phase, you might want to time it with when the sun's out. Think about some load that's on during the day, like your air conditioner, and it can actually make things more balanced by using your noggin, your brain. Is that a German word, noggin? Sounds sort of Germanish.